Okay, so we move on to Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney lived between 1554 and 1586. Sir Philip Sidney lived between 1554 and 1586. He is a major literary critic of the Renaissance. He is a major literary critic of the Renaissance. His critical ideas are contained in a work entitled An Apology for Poetry. His critical ideas are contained in a work entitled An Apology for Poetry. It was published in 1595. It was published in 1595. The other title of the work is In Defense of Poesy. The other title of the work is In Defense of Poesy. In Defense of Poesy. In Defense of Poesy. It is widely believed that An Apology for Poetry, or In Defense of Poesy, inaugurated the English literary tradition, or English literary criticism. It is widely believed that In Defense of Poetry inaugurated the English literary tradition and the English literary criticism. In keeping with the spirit of the Renaissance, Sidney's work draws largely from the works of classical writers. Sidney's work draws largely from the works of the classical writers like Plato, Aristotle, Horace, among others. In this work, Sidney places poetry above other genres of literature, places more value on poetry compared to the other genres of literature. He emphasizes the Aristotelian unity of action, time, and place. He emphasizes the Aristotelian unity of action, time, and place. He values poetry so much that he even places a curse on all those who do not love poetry. He values poetry so much that he places a curse on anyone who does not love poetry. We move on to John Dryden. John Dryden. John Dryden lived between 1631 and 1700. John Dryden lived between 1631 and 1700. 1631 and 1700. He embodies the spirits and ideals of the neoclassical period. Embodies the spirit, ideals of the neoclassical period. John Dryden embodies the spirit and the ideals of the neoclassical period. Dr. Samuel Johnson attributes to Dryden. Dr. Samuel Johnson attributes to Dryden, quotes, the improvement, perhaps the completion of our meter, the improvement, perhaps the completion of our meter, the refinement of our language, and much of the correctness of our sentiments, unquote. The improvement, perhaps the completion of our meter, M-E-T-E-R, meter, the refinement of our language, and much of the correctness of our sentiments, unquote. The statements is indicative of the influence that Dryden had on the literature and criticism of his time. The statement is indicative of the influence that Dryden had on the literature and criticism of his time. Remember, he had an age named after him, the age of Dryden. Now, most of Dryden's ideas on literary criticism are contained in a work entitled an essay of dramatic poesy. Most of Dryden's ideas on literary criticism are contained in a work entitled An Essay of Dramatic Poesy. An Essay of Dramatic Poesy, published in 1668. Published in 1668, and that is the 17th century. I suppose this work must have been assigned or was assigned to one of the groups in the previous year's presentation. So in the work, there's a debate. There's a debate on what to imitate. In an essay of dramatic poesy, there's a debate as to what to imitate. There's a debate as to what to imitate. Should we imitate nature, or should we imitate the great writers of antiquity? Should we imitate nature, or should we imitate the great writers of antiquity, the ancient writers, the classical writers? What is to be imitated? Is it nature, or is it nature, or the ancient writers? The work also emphasizes the Aristotelian unity of time, place, and action. The work also emphasizes the Aristotelian unity of action, place, and time. It suggests that the language of poetry should be based on proper speech. It emphasizes that the language of poetry should be based on what? Proper speech. It also suggests that decorum should define our drama. Decorum should define our drama. In the debate as to the superiority between English drama and French drama, English drama is preferred at the end. Because English drama is rich in diversity, and its stagecraft, stagecraft as well as being blessed with Shakespearean contribution. With Shakespearean contribution. So the debate ends with English drama as the winner for its diversity, its stage, and Shakespearean tradition. Dryden maintains that literature should be defined by clarity. Literature should be defined by clarity. Literature should be defined by clarity, order, decorum, elegance, cleverness, and wit. Clarity, order, decorum, elegance, cleverness, and wit. Wit, W-I-T, wit, should define our drama. We move on to Alexander Pope. Move on to Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope lived between 1688. Alexander Pope lived between 1688 and 1744. He was a major writer of the Augustan era, also known as the Age of Pope, named after himself. He is the author of The Rape of the Lock, but we are studying him today because of his ideas on literary criticism. We are studying him today because of his ideas on literary criticism. As contained in Essay on Criticism, published in 1711. As contained in Essay on Criticism, published in 1711. In this work, Pope insists that poets should imitate classical authors. It is the same idea that you have in John Dryden's An Essay of Dramatic Poesy. The need to imitate the ancient. In this work, Pope insists that poets should do what? Imitate classical authors. You imitate the ancients and you imitate the best. If you imitate the ancients, then you imitate the best. So poets should imitate classical authors. Of course, this is what neoclassical literary criticism was all about. the act of drawing from the Greek and Roman literary tradition. He also maintained that critics should derive their standards of judgment from classical antiquity. Critics should derive their standards of judgment from classical antiquity. Critics should derive their standards of judgment, their critical principles, rules, and so on from the classical period. For the 18th century critics, these standards of judgment should be in the area of poetic diction. For the 18th century critics, these literary standards should be seen in the area of poetic diction, the use of heroic couplets, the personification of abstraction, as well as refined emotions or restraints. As well as refined emotions or restraint. As well as refined emotion or restraint. Poetic diction, the use of heroic couplets. All these terms were explained during survey of English class. The personification of abstraction and refined emotion or restraint. Then we move on to William Wordsworth. So if you want me to spell William, no problem. So William Wordsworth lived between 1770 to 1850. William Wordsworth lived between 1770 and 1850. 1770 and 1850. He is a major critic of the Romantic period. He's a major critic of the Romantic period. And his criticism is nothing but Romantic criticism. He's a major critic of the Romantic period, and his criticism is nothing but Romantic criticism. His major critical ideas are contained in the preface to the lyrical ballads. Preface to the lyrical ballads. Published in 1798. Published in 1798. Its major ideas are contained in the preface to the lyrical ballads, published in 1798. In this work, Wordsworth sees poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, thus emphasizing emotions, feelings, sentiments in the writing of poetry, as against the logic and reason that characterize neoclassical literature, in defining poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. Wordsworth emphasizes emotions, feelings, sentiments in the writing of poetry as against reason and logic, which characterized neoclassical poetry, that is, poetry of the previous age. Hence, it can be said that in the Romantic tradition, poetry is expressive. In the Romantic tradition, poetry is expressive. It's expressive because it carries the emotion. It conveys the emotion of the writer. Poetry is expressive because it conveys the emotion of the writer, the feelings of the writer. So perhaps expressive criticism was inaugurated with Romanticism, romantic poetry as expressed by William Wordsworth in the preface to the lyrical ballads. So in the Romantic period, poetry experienced a radical shift. In the Romantic period, poetry experienced a radical shift in subject matter and language. In subject matter and language. The subject matter of poetry in the Romantic period was nature and the natural environment. It was nature in a natural environment. Poetry depicted nature or aspects of nature like the flowers, the hillside, the stream, the spring, the river, the mountains, the animals. In fact, in romantic poetry, the subject matter is not the highly placed, but the lowly placed. Romantic poetry, the subject matter is not the highly placed, but the lowly placed. The subject matter is not kings and queens, but the peasants and the poor, the common people. So the attention drawn to the common people at this time was affected by first the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783. The attention drawn to the plight of the underdogs and the common people in society and literature was affected by first the American Revolution, which took place between 1775 and 1783. Secondly, and more importantly, more proximal to the scene of change was the French Revolution. Second was the French Revolution, which took place between 1789 and 1799. The French Revolution, which took place between 1789 and 1799. In the American Revolution, the American colonies rebelled against the British colonial masters and would eventually gain their independence. And in the French Revolution, the common people rebelled against the monarchs, the rulers. In the French Revolution, common people rebelled against the monarchs and rulers. Though the revolution did not actually happen in England, though the revolution did not actually take place in England, its effects were felt in literature and in the perception of common people. Its effects were felt in how common people suddenly became important and how literature began to pay attention to common people. So that is how the subject matter of romantic literature is the lowly placed. Blacks, slaves, servants, People that were hitherto not regarded for anything are now important in romantic literature, including animals and nature. Nothing is to be joked with. Everything is now important. Everyone is now important. The language of romantic literature, the language of romantic literature, the language of romantic literature is the vernacular. That is language as used by the common people. It's the common tongue. We call it rustic language. Rustic language. Rustic language. So you could see that it is in complete contrast to the language deployed in neoclassical literature, because you need to understand that Romanticism rebelled against neoclassicism. There was no more restraint or decorum, but only the outpouring of emotion in romantic literature. In neoclassical literature, you had decorum, restraint, okay? But in romantic literature, you have the outpouring of emotion, okay? Which is why we started by defining romantic poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Meaning that romantic poetry is expressive. Then we move on from there to Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine lived between 1828 and 1893. Hippolyte Taine lived between 1828 and 1893. Hippolyte Taine lived between 1828 and 1893. He was a French historian and literary critic. Was a French historian and literary critic. His criticism captures the ethos of the Victorian period. His criticism captures the ethos of the Victorian period. Now, in the Victorian period, is usually noted for its scientific achievements. The Victorian period is usually noted for its scientific achievements. For its scientific achievements. And how those scientific achievements impacted previously held values in society. And how those scientific achievements impacted previously held values in society. The Victorian society was one that was disrupted by science. The Victorian society was one whose stability was disrupted by science. Whose stability was disrupted by science. As can be seen in two publications. Can be seen in two publications. Will be seen in two publications. One is Das Kapital. Das Kapital. One is Das Kapital. Das Kapital. Or Capital, published in 1867 by Karl Marx. Published in 1867 by Karl Marx. By Karl Marx. Karl. By Karl Marx. So in this work, it is seen that for the first time in human history, it is seen that there is the existence of economic forces in society. For the first time in human history, it is revealed scientifically, logically, intellectually, that there exists what? Economic forces in society. And these forces impact the individual's life. Exist economic forces in society, and these forces impact the individual's life. It's also seen that wealth is not a matter of luck. Wealth is not a matter of luck. Being wealthy is not about being lucky, but it is through taking structural actions by certain individuals in society. By taking structural actions by certain individuals in society. So it was useless to sit down and pray for wealth. Rather, the individual needed to do certain things, take certain actions. Okay? Actually, those who occupy the wealth structure of society are the owners of capital. Are the owners of capital. Those who occupy the wealth structure of society are the owners of capital. Are the owners of capital. And they are the ones who invest this capital and make profits through the labors of the workers, who by virtue of their wages will never be rich, because the wages are just conditioned to keep them afloat, to keep working for the owners of the capital. Another important work that revolutionized society at this time was on the origin of species. On the origin of species. On the origin of species by Charles Darwin, published in 1859. On the origin of species by Charles Darwin, published in 1859. Darwin's work contradicts the biblical claims of creation. Darwin's work was revolutionary in the sense that it contradicted the biblical claims of creation. The biblical claims of creation, that is, that man was created by a good and loving God. That's what the Bible claims. But on the origin of species claims that man was not created, but rather man evolved from lower creatures. Man was not created, but rather man evolved from lower creatures over millions of years.
Let's agree man was not created. But who created the creations for which man was?
Okay. So, Darwin's ideas created a number of fallouts. Because if man was not created, then man is just one of the higher animals. You know, the controversy between the evolutionary theory and the theory of creation is an unending one. It goes on through the ages, and each time it comes up, it generates emotions in people who stand on either side. Okay? I think the debate should be kept open as science progresses and so on and so forth, but I don't want to be part of the debate, okay? Because I love my life. So another consequence of this idea is the concept of survival of the fittest. The concept of the survival of the fittest. That is, that life selects in cell selection, call it cell selection. Life selects the best cells to survive. Survival of the fittest. That life selects the best cells to survive. CELLS, cells to survive. Also meaning that life is competitive, and this competition does not favor the weak. Life is competitive, and there's no way that this competition favors the weak. The weak are usually left off to die. Or eaten up by the stronger. In any habitat. So life seen as a race to survival, even in the human reproduction, drains it of any form of morality. Because people can do whatever they can to be the first. So arising from all this, Taine wrote the history of English literature. Taine wrote the history of English literature. The history of English literature, and this work captures the scientific spirit of the age. This work captured the scientific spirit of the age. It was published in 1864. The history of English literature was published in 1864. One of the ideas that came out of all this scientific publication was the idea of historical and scientific determinism. historical and scientific determinism. That is, that human beings are highly determined beings, and that there are historical and scientific forces that shape our lives. In Karl Marx, we had the economic forces. In Darwin, we had the biological forces. Taine's work, The History of the English Language, established the historical approach to literary interpretation. Taine's work established the historical approach to literary interpretation. Historical approach. Taine's work, The History of English Literature, established the historical approach to the interpretation of literature. That is, seeing literature as a response to history. In the work, he states that text should be studied alongside its author. Text should be studied alongside its author. Taine is of the opinion that text should be studied alongside its author. Text should be studied alongside its author. And milieu. And milieu. 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 A work of art should be studied alongside its author, should be studied alongside its environment. The environment that produces that work is the milieu. All right? In order for the text to be properly understood, you have to take into consideration the author and the society in which the work emanates from for better understanding of the work. He formalized the 4 categories that should be taken into consideration when studying a text. And they are race, R-A-C-E, race, comma, milieu, comma, moment, and dominant faculty. Race, milieu, moment, and dominant faculty. You should not be destructive. You should not be destructive. Race, milieu, moment, and dominant faculty. Moment. You get. Good. So by race, Taine means the beliefs, the totality of the people's beliefs, culture and emotions. By race, 10 means the totality of people's belief, their culture and emotion. By milieu, 10 refers to the environment, the surrounding, the country that produces the work. By moment, we are talking about the time in which the work is written. Talk about the time in which the work is written. By dominant faculty, we are talking about the individual talent of the writer. The individual talent of the writer. So from here you have 10's formula for the interpretation of literature. From here we have 10's formula. We have 10's formula for the interpretation of literature. As follows: race plus milieu plus moment plus dominant faculty is equal to work of art. Race plus milieu plus moment plus dominant faculty is equal to work of literature. This is what comes together to make up the work of literature. And then 10 leaves us with this expression which you must remember, that you study the text in order to know the man. You study the text in order to know the man. You study the text in order to know the man. Right? Right? You study the text in order to know the man. Meaning that you can tell the dancer from his dance. Okay? You can tell the dancer from his dance. You can infer the dancer from his dance. We use the work of art to get to know the author. Just as we use the dance to know the dancer, you can tell the dancer from his dance. All right, so we move on to Matthew Arnold. Move on to Matthew Arnold. Move on to Matthew Arnold. Arnold is spelled Arnold. I can spell Matthew. You want me to? So Matthew Arnold lived between 1822 and 1888. Matthew Arnold lived between 1822 and 1888. He was a Victorian writer, poet, and critic. veteran writer, poet, and critic. He was also an educationist, a school inspector, also an educationist, a school inspector, also an educationist, a schools inspector. His ideas on literature and criticism are contained in 2 works. His ideas on literature and literary criticism are contained in 2 works. These are the study of poetry. These are the study of poetry and the function of criticism at the present time. The study of poetry and the function of criticism at the present time. In the midst of the uncertainty created by scientific discoveries in the Victorian period, in the midst of the uncertainties created by scientific discoveries in the Victorian period, Arnold believes that poetry can provide the much needed truths, values, and guidance for society. In the midst of the uncertainties created by scientific discoveries in the Victorian period, Arnold believes that poetry can provide the much needed truths, values, guidelines for society. We can find in poetry what we could use to stabilize society, find some level of certainty and values to operate with. So you can see how poetry is important. Arnold elevates poetry above religion, science, and philosophy. Arnold elevates poetry above religion, science, and philosophy. Because in the Victorian period, we are talking about the conflict between religion and science, between science and religion. So, because poetry can provide the solution, he elevates poetry above what? Science, religion, and philosophy. Arnold believes that criticism should be disinterested. Arnold believes that criticism should be a disinterested endeavor. Criticism should be a disinterested endeavor. That means it should be guided by objectivity. Criticism should be guided by objectivity. Critics should use the objective criteria to determine. Critics should use the objective criteria to determine, quote, the higher truth or seriousness of a work of art based on classical critical values. Critics should use the objective criteria to determine the higher truths or the seriousness of a work of art based on classical critical values. Based on classical critical values. I should tell that again. Critics should use the objective criteria to determine the higher truth or seriousness of a work of art based on what? Classical critical value. The critic should aim to be so the critic should become the preserver of society's values. The critic should become the preserver of society's values. Arnold believes that the critic should become the preserver of society's values. He also believes that classical rules should be applied to poetry. Classical rules should be applied to the interpretation of poetry. Classical rules should be applied to the interpretation of poetry. Then we move on to Henry James. Henry James. Henry James. I would like my J. Henry James lived between 1843 and 1916. Henry James lived between 1843 and 1916. His ideas on literature and literary criticism are contained in The Art of Fiction. The Art of Fiction. The Art of Fiction. The Art of Fiction. Published in 1884. Published in 1884. Henry James is interested in the novel because the novel has been around for a while, but without adequate articulate theory to account for its existence. Henry James is interested in the novel because, you see, the novel has been around for some time, right from the 17th century. The novel has been around, like from the sentimental novels of the 17th century to the realistic novel, beginning with Robinson Crusoe in the 18th century, to the 19th century novels of Jane Austen. The novel has been around for a while, but without adequate theory to account for its existence. So Henry James is interested in the novel, and you could see that in the title of his critical work, The Art of Fiction, 1884. This work is said to be the first well-articulated theory of the novel. He is accredited with the first well-articulated theory of the novel. First well-articulated theory of the novel. Among other things, among other theses stated in the work, James believes that the novel should first be interesting and realistic. The novel should first be what? Interesting and realistic. So realism is usually attributed to the novel. Realism is usually attributed to the novel. The novel should first be what? Interesting and realistic. The novel should first be interesting and realistic. Good. So the idea of the novel being interesting, denotes the primary function of literature. Right? Denotes the primary function of literature. It has to be interesting. And the idea of the novel being realistic accounts for the faithful depiction of life as it is in the work of arts. Life should, when we compare what is in the work and what is in life, we shouldn't see much disparity. The novel should be organic. The novel should be organic. The novel should be organic, meaning that it should have a life of its own. The novel should be organic, meaning that it should have a life of its own. The novel should be organic, meaning that it should have a life of its own. The novel should be self-contained. All the parts should be well related, should be organically related. In writing the novel, there's need for the author to create a distance between himself and the work. There's need for the author to create a distance between himself and the work. This is called artistic distance. There's need for the author to create artistic distance between the work and himself. That is part of the creativity and imaginativeness that goes into the crafting of the novel. It's part of the creativity or the imaginativeness that goes into the crafting of the novel. Okay? The author should create a distance between himself and the work. The work should not look like the author. It's artistic distance. And that distance is bridged by creativity. In writing the novel, Henry James states that the aim is to show, not to tell. The aim is to show, not to tell. The aim is to show, demonstrate, dramatize, and not just to narrate. So the aim is to show and not to tell. In writing the novel, Henry James maintains that the aim should be to show and not to tell. The aim is to show and not to tell. Despite all of this, James retained impressionistic criticism in the appreciation of the novel. James retained impressionistic criticism in the interpretation of the novel. And now we move on to modern literary criticism. We are getting closer and closer home. From where we began in the classical period, see how far we have come. All right? See what the Lord has done. We are now in modern literary criticism. From where we began with the classical literary criticism. So you could see how far the Lord has brought us. Okay? So modern literary criticism. This is the criticism of the 20th century. This is the criticism of the 20th century. And by that we mean the 1900s. From 1900 down. When we get to modern literary criticism, it is observed that literary criticism branches into different theoretical directions. Literary criticism branches into different theoretical directions with many different proponents of diverse ideas. So when it gets to modern period, it is a salad, right? Criticism becomes a salad. Okay? Of different servings. So modernism itself, so you should enjoy modern literary criticism because it's a salad, right? Okay, think of it as a salad of many different servings. Okay?
Started with this man, Terry Egerton.
Why? Egerton is a recent literary figure of the 20th century. So when we talk about the origins of criticism, we go back to the classical period. Maybe it began a particular type of criticism, not criticism as a whole. All right, because he is You can sit down. He's more of post-colonial critic, post-colonial Marxist critic. So he could not have begun literary criticism itself, which goes back to the classical period, with guys like Aristotle and Plato. All right. So modernism itself, as I was saying, was partly triggered, as brought about by the aftermath of the First World War. The aftermath of the First World War. Aftermath. The aftermath of the First World War. Which lasted between 1914 and 1918. Which lasted between 1914 and 1918. Modernism is marked by a radical break with tradition. Modernism is marked by a radical break with tradition. By that we mean the culture and the values of the previous eras, especially Romanticism. Modernism is marked by a radical break with tradition. And by that we mean culture and values of the previous ages, especially Romanticism. In fact, modernism is opposed to Romanticism. The tenets of modernism are opposed to the tenets of Romanticism. So modernism should be seen in terms of deep and radical breaks with tradition in arts and in culture. Made possible by the new ideas that were put forward owing to how society and life had changed after the First World War. We have modernist precursors. We have modernist precursors. We have modernist precursors. We have modernist precursors. In the ideas of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, F-R-I-E-D-R-I-C-H, Friedrich Nietzsche, spelled Nietzsche. The great Nietzsche. He lived between 1844 and 1900. He proposed the nihilist philosophy. The nihilist proposed the nihilist philosophy. The philosophy nihilism or nihilism does not believe in organized society, kicks against the existence of organized society and in its institutions. The philosophy nihilism does not believe in the existence of organized society and its institutions like religion and religious and political institutions. Invariably, as far as the nihilist is concerned, there is no God. There's no God, and our life is meaningless. As far as the nihilist is concerned, there is no God, and there is no meaning to be derived from life. Because life is meaningless. The nihilist does not believe in an organized society and its institutions, like religious and political institutions. And the nihilist does not believe in God or that there is any meaning to be derived from life. So Nietzsche was a nihilist. Nietzsche is a nihilist. Let me stop because I'm saying things. For instance, he proposed that there is no God anywhere in the universe, and that if God ever existed, that the forces of existence had acted on him and is no more in the universe. Right? Just like every other being, the forces of existence would have acted on God and it would be no more about the universe.
You gotta get mine.
In other words, God had died as far as nature was concerned, just like any other living being. Okay? So when nature finally died, his enemies mocked him. When nature finally died, his enemies mocked him. Those who did not like his ideas mocked him. And they wrote on his tomb, "Here lies the man who said that God was dead. He is now dead, but God lives on." Wow. Here lies the man who said that God was dead. He is now dead, but God lives on. So that shows how bitter they were about nature's idea. So you could see that in the aftermath of the First World War, people lost faith in the existence of God. People lost faith in the existence of God, and they began to accept the ideas of Nietzsche, who only died some 15 years before, 1900. And the war was 1914, 1918. Perhaps Nietzsche was right, because a good and loving God will not stay and watch people die in millions without intervening. Maybe there was actually nowhere, maybe it was nowhere to be found in the universe, as Nietzsche had said. Okay? So, modernism is marked by irreverence towards the religious and towards the sacred, towards the existence of God. Another person whose ideas influenced modernism was Karl Marx. We already talked about him, so we won't dwell on that. It was Karl Marx with his economic forces, the perpetual subjugation of the workers who will never be rich because he's not the owner of capital. He's only paid skewed wages for his labors, to keep him afloat and to keep him working for the owners of the capital. Another modernist precursor is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud. Freud's ideas influenced modernism, because with him we came in contact, or we knew the existence of what we call psychological forces. All right? Psychological forces, because the individual is at the mercy of his mind, mental constitution. That's what makes the man. So you lose your mind and you invariably lose your life. To lose your mind is to lose your life. But the mind itself is very delicate. Yet, it controls everything about the individual, his personalities, actions, motives. So, perhaps the God of man is the mind, and not any outside force, because you use your mind to know everything, to do everything. Your consciousness is what you use to do everything. You write with your consciousness. You are in class because you have your consciousness about you. Once you lose it, you are not fit to live in human society. So there is what we call the psychological force that acts on the individual. And the individual is at the mercy of these psychological forces. And so many things could determine how these forces act on the individual, including the nature of the environment, the individual's upbringing, the individual's childhood. Because when you study Freud, you see that it does not say anything that is far away from childhood and how the individual was raised. Freud does not say anything independent of the individual's childhood. He keeps saying, go back to the childhood of the individual, because that is where this personality, this mental constitution was formed, in the processes of growth, the stages of growth. So he divided the human mind into the conscious and the unconscious. Conscious and the unconscious. Whereby the conscious regulates our daily activities. Whereas the unconscious is dark and latent and stays out of sight to influence present actions unknown to the individual. No problem.
First, from Karl Marx, we learned that there are different from Sigmund, then there's psychology, from each other person will learn to politics. How is it that these men are able to believe in forces to affect humanity, but they don't believe in it? It baffles me. They believe that there are forces, but they don't believe in the great force. Then number two, Sigmund Freud, from his writings, usually refers to childhood. So can we say that somehow Sigmund Freud was an infantist?
Well, in a way, but his theory is psychoanalysis, not infantism. Okay? But maybe he contributed to understanding that it is important how we raise children. But I didn't say that we should centralize the discussion of children in literature. Right? We know who said that, right? And then for the conception of God as the creator of the universe, okay, negates scientific assumptions in the evolutionary theory that the universe evolved along with its content over millions of years, that nobody said, let there be man, and there was man at instant. And at least there is no scientific proof as far as they are concerned to that effect. So that's why some scientists, or most scientists, find it difficult to believe in the existence of God. All right. So they rather would believe in these verifiable forces rather than on an individual who said that everything should come into being within 7 days, and it happened. Okay?
Are there literary works that should be read on this?
Should be read. The concept of what?
The whole concept of
materials on this concept of God. Okay, it's possible. We can start with the Bible. Because otherwise you'll be dealing with science. In literature usually has this pessimistic tone towards all the subject matter, especially modernist literature. So what you will see in modernist literature is a kind of doubt raised on the existence of God, and so on and so forth. So literature maintains that stance. But you can also, it depends on the writer. Like if you have a new humanist writer, will centralize God in his writing. But the humanist writer will not. He will centralize man. So it depends. Everything depends on the perspective. Who is writing, who is speaking, and so on and so forth. Alright, so we'll stop the class there for today. When we come back, we'll dwell more on modernist criticism before we go elsewhere. You can take a break, 5 to 10 minutes.